In 2008, I was a speaker at a conference in Berkeley, California. At dinner one night, one of the conference organizers mentioned that her youngest children had never been vaccinated. I must have had a look of astonishment on my face because the other speaker broke in quickly, as if to forestall any disagreement among us, and said, "That's a personal family decision." At the time, I thought to myself, but I did not say, I don't think it's a personal family decision. I think it's a public health decision. Around the same time, I noticed that colleagues of mine with children born after 2000 were nervous when their kids got vaccinated. So I wanted to understand these two phenomena, how people a lot like me, but who had kids about a decade younger than mine, were nervous about vaccination in a way that I had never been, and how something that I thought of as a routine public health measure could be framed as a personal family decision. Vaccination protects individuals from illness and communities from spread. When people are protected from severe disease, both they and their communities benefit. Individuals avoid suffering, expense, personal and family stress. Health systems are not overburdened, and social disruption is minimized. But not everyone agrees that the goal of community protection warrants intrusion into people's personal health decisions. For those who champion personal liberty over the common good, or who believe the common good is best attained through personal liberty, individual rights present a challenge to community protection. This conflict between the individual and the public good is at the heart of vaccination controversy throughout history. The public good side of the equation motivates compulsory measures to protect populations. But compulsory measures infringe on people's bodily autonomy. And vaccination, unlike other public health measures like public sewers or clean water, is a medical procedure that is performed on people's bodies. As a result, people have protected their bodily autonomy throughout history by violently protesting compulsory vaccination. In the 19th century, in Britain and the United States, there were riots against compulsory smallpox vaccination. We should not imagine that vaccine resistance in our own time period would be any different, because competing notions of the good remain. And this is one reason why scientific evidence will not adjudicate this conflict, because it is not primarily about evidence, but about which notion of the good should prevail. Another conflict in vaccination controversy pits a view of vaccines as harmful against a view of vaccination uptake as an ongoing public health crisis. Stories of vaccine harms and vaccination crisis are both persuasive, but to different audiences. Vaccine injury is a personal story of harm experienced for the greater good. It is framed as a harm that is authorized by the government and meted out on the bodies of innocent people, especially children. Vaccination crisis, on the other hand, is a public health story that frames each incidence of infectious disease as a dangerous outbreak, and every drop in vaccination rates as a dire threat to public health. The language of crisis has become the automatic go-to rhetoric to communicate the dangers of letting up on vaccination efforts. But this language of crisis makes it difficult to see containment of infectious disease as a public health success. Instead, there's always a focus on disease incidence and the dangers of non-vaccination. Heralding containment as a goal of vaccination programs would allow us to tell a different story about the public good of vaccination. We could talk about high enough levels of vaccination that are demonstrated by successful containment of infectious disease. But the ongoing sense of crisis means that vaccination rates are never good enough. They could always be better. And those who don't vaccinate are represented as risking everybody's health rather than acting responsibly on their own beliefs. The result? Two incommensurable viewpoints, one which sees vaccine harms for individuals and the other which sees disease harms for communities and populations. This incommensurability contributes to a lack of trust. Some people don't see the government or public health as having their best interests at heart, and they lack confidence that healthcare works in their favor. On the flip side, public health officials are frustrated with communities that lag in vaccination attainment, just as they are frustrated with the lack of a shared vision of population health. These two basic conflicts in vaccination controversy are joined by two more philosophical issues, one which considers people's responsibility toward one another, and the other which thinks of illness as a constitutive aspect of being human. There are more and more people with immunocompromising conditions, in part due to new classes of biological drugs that treat autoimmune diseases by suppressing the immune system, and in part due to increasing use of chemotherapies that damage the immune system, temporarily or more permanently. Of course, many people benefit tremendously from use of these medications. But there are social consequences for communities based on how these medications work and the expectations that they engender. People who are immunocompromised are susceptible to infection. And because they often do not respond robustly to vaccination, they are vulnerable to infectious disease. They can be protected when enough people in their communities are vaccinated. But this begs the question, what is owed to people with immunocompromising conditions? Who decides what risk to the self is acceptable for the sake of others? This concern about vaccination, that it causes some people to be responsible for the health of other people whose vulnerability is caused by treatment, is a concern about iatrogenesis and medicalization. Iatrogenesis means illness that is caused by medicine, and medicalization describes a world in which people are increasingly dependent on drugs, doctors, and healthcare just to live normal lives. Medications that cause people to be sick in other ways through so-called side effects are iatrogenic. The requirement that healthy people be vaccinated in order to protect those who are immunocompromised demonstrates medicalization. Both iatrogenesis and medicalization are resisted by people who think that forms of modern medicine make us sick rather than well. Resistance to medicalization can be traced back to the anti-psychiatry movement of the 1950s and has been studied in sociology since at least the 1970s. Vaccine dissent draws on this history, criticizing the enlarging social authority of medicine and emphasizing alternative views of health. From this perspective, requiring some people to be vaccinated in order to protect the health of those whose vulnerability is iatrogenic forces those people into processes of medicalization that are dangerous and risky. In a 1926 essay called On Being Ill, British author Virginia Woolf used two metaphors to describe the experience of being healthy and ill, the upright and the recumbent. When one is ill, she wrote, one is removed from the army of the upright, those people who go to work and sustain civilization. When one is ill, one lies recumbent, perhaps looking up at the sky, which, she points out, can be illuminating. After all, we don't look at it all that often. In other words, getting sick changes your perspective. It also, she wrote, makes one sympathetic to the suffering of others. Many people believe that getting sick and getting better are processes that make one resilient and healthy. After all, this is a lesson from basic immunology. A participant in one of my research studies once described getting sick as a workout for the immune system. One of my cousins once told me that he would rather get the flu than a flu shot. He didn't mean he would rather be in the hospital on a ventilator than get an influenza vaccine. What he meant was maybe getting sick with the flu wasn't such a bad way to gain immunity from it. Maybe it was better than vaccination. Based on my research, this is not an uncommon view. The idea that getting sick is part of what it means to be healthy is linked to the idea that illness is a part of what it means to be human. From this perspective, to be vaccinated is to remove the possibility of strengthening the body through natural illness and strengthening the social body through the sympathetic disposition that illness imparts. We see this idea expressed in platitudes like, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger," as well as in the framing of disease experiences as journeys. When I ask my students to describe experiences of childhood illness, they talk about days home from school, Campbell's soup and ginger ale, family rituals, special treatment. While illness is rarely fun, it is part of our shared story. So when I think back to the conversation and the concerns that led me to study vaccination controversy, I see now that the assertion that vaccination is a personal family decision is just one side of a long-standing debate. I also see that once the story of vaccine harms becomes a legible social narrative of vaccination consequences, it makes it easier for parents to see the potential for harm than the contribution that vaccination makes to the common good. In the 1990s, several social forces, including an increasing number of vaccines recommended for children, nudged that discourse of harm into the mainstream. And then public health revved up the discourse of crisis because more concerns about vaccines were being voiced. By the time I started studying vaccination controversy in the 2010s, this pattern had been fully established. What was also fully established was that people who don't vaccinate aren't following the science. But my research has taught me to listen for the underlying philosophical issues, the rhetorical framing, and a disposition toward illness. Focusing on misinformation as a primary driver of vaccine dissent is distracting. It distracts us from the existential questions that vaccine resistance points us toward, those fault lines that about what risks individuals are willing to take on, what it means to be a member of a community, and whether illness is good or bad for humanity at large, or individuals in particular. Focusing on who's right or who's wrong or which evidence is true moves us further into difference, not toward common ground. Addressing those existential questions could bring us closer. At a time when social rifts are palpable in the most mundane social encounters, a return to those questions and the values they represent offers an opportunity to consider how to ensure the public's health in a pluralist society. Pluralist societies are those in which people from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different religious traditions, different beliefs and perspectives and opinions live together and govern themselves. Pluralism is a founding principle and normative goal of the United States. In a pluralist society, assuming that those who disagree with you are wrong is limiting, because pluralism demands a heightened responsibility to listen to others, to learn to compromise, and to live with unresolved differences. And pluralism demands productive social engagement in order to make rules about the common good. Given that vaccination controversy reveals distinct ideas about what constitutes the common good, it is a fitting example of a social problem that needs people to come together through difference. It is easy to assume that the people on the other side are being manipulated by misinformation. Both vaccine dissenters and vaccine promoters have their own view of that problem. Pharmaceutical companies can shield certain kinds of negative data from the public. False claims pervade the internet. These things are true, but focusing on them does not solve a problem that is rooted in divergent beliefs about the human value of illness, responsibility toward others, and individual bodily autonomy in relation to community benefit. Make no mistake, public health in a pluralist society is challenging. Leaning into difference at least has the benefit of identifying the right problem. It may well be that we would all benefit from lying down and looking up at the sky, as Virginia Woolf suggested so many years ago. Thank you.